So if everybody would take a seat, please. We'll get started. Well, good morning and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to those watching over the internet. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a resident scholar here at AEI, and I direct our program on American citizenship. This morning's topic is reforming the VA by empowering veterans. Now, since we have a limited amount of time, let me just begin by outlining how we're going to proceed. First off, we'll hear from Congressman Brad Wenstrup, who has sponsored and introduced a number of important bills dealing with veteran transition, education, and economic opportunities. The Congressman's remarks will be followed by a conversation between him and the highly respected Military Times journalist Leo Shane. Time permitting, we will then take questions from the floor before the Congressman has to head back to the Hill and do his day job. Next up, we'll have a panel discussion with panelists Heather Ansley of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, Lauren Augustine of Student Veterans of America, my colleague Rebecca Burgess of American Enterprise Institute, and Philip Carter of the RAND Corporation. Leo, again, will moderate that panel discussion, and time permitting, again, we'll take questions from the floor. Now, let me conclude by noting that Veterans Affairs is a topic that AEI scholars Sally Sattel, Tom Donnelly, and Rebecca Burgess have been monitoring and writing about for some time. But writing about policy is one thing. Actually producing legislation to improve veteran affairs is another. And that's why we're especially delighted to have Congressman Wenstrup here with us today. A doctor, an Army reservist who served in Iraq as a combat surgeon and was awarded a Bronze Star. The Congressman sits on both key committees in this area, the Armed Services Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committees. He is the subcommittee chair on veteran health and serves on the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee. In short, very few, if any, members are more experienced and knowledgeable about this very important topic. Congressman, welcome. The mic is yours.
This is a little like Star Trek, I think you were saying, or Merv Griffin, but I do appreciate it. It's an honor for me to be here at AEI. This is an institution that I respect tremendously, and I appreciate the good works that you do, and I've had the opportunity to work with you on many topics over the years that I've been in Congress, and I appreciate it, and have had many interactions with Arthur Brooks. It's been very helpful for us. So, you know, here's the VA, right, to care for those that have borne the battle. And that's what we're supposed to do. And that we recently, out of committee just last week, passed our community care bill, which I hope will move on and get through both the House, the Senate, and signed by the President. And this is an opportunity, as we're talking about empowering the veteran themselves, to create more of the decision-making process on the health care front to be between the doctor and the patient. But as you look at the VA and you see what's taking place, the VA is reactive to the needs of the veteran. They don't have much opportunity to be proactive, and that's one of the things that we want to change. And by reactive, I mean, you know, someone comes back from war, and that's when they start to have problems, right? Because if you look at those that are in uniform, they're part of something big. They're part of something where they're needed. They're part of something that's bigger than themselves, and they have a purpose. And when you get out of uniform, if you're not working, if you don't get up each day with a purpose, that's when things start to spiral. If you look at the suicides, which are up in society itself, not just within veterans, but if you look at the suicides, they don't happen very often while you're in uniform. And I recently read a book, and we've had him testify in front of Congress, a book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, who embedded with Marines in Afghanistan, and he's well versed on these things. And he talked about veterans, and he said what they do mind is not feeling necessary. And we had some veterans testify that said they were very close to suicide. And these are 3 that decided not to and found ways to get better. And they said, you know, I was in the military. It taught me that there was nothing I couldn't overcome. But when I got out and I had some problems, and I had some issues, they told me, well, you're disabled, here's a check, rather than I want to get better. And that's a problem we have, and it's not across the whole VA, don't get me wrong. And you know, we have the expression, if you've been to one VA, you've been to one VA. And that's true, but our society is different today. And he wrote the book Tribe because he says in a tribe, everyone has a purpose. Somebody hunts, somebody cooks, somebody protects, somebody builds. Even kids have a job. And so they're part of something and they're necessary. And today, for a veteran who comes back and they don't have a plan, they're adrift and there's food in the store, there's gas at the pump, and everyone's going about their business. And I think that that is what they face that is so difficult for them, is they're not feeling necessary. And that's what we want to change. And I want to change it from the beginning. So serving on armed services and VA gives you an opportunity to engage in this way. And imagine if you're being recruited for the military, and some of you probably have been. And you go in, they talk about, well, what branch do you want to go into? Okay, you've made that decision. Well, what do you want to do in the military? What is it? Do you want to fly? Do you want to do this, do that? What if while they're recruiting you, they said, okay, well, let's make a plan, because not only what do you want to do in the military, what do you want to do after? Because we're looking at you and we want your long-term success. So whether you're going to do 4 years or 24 years, what are you going to do after? How can we make a plan for you? And to me, that shows that you're investing in this person, this American that's deciding to serve their country, not only in uniform, but after. And I think that's a big deal. And so we're trying to make that transition make more sense. When you're at the point in your military career that you are starting to think about what you want to do, shouldn't you be having some conversations with professionals that can take you through a process and not only show you what your opportunities are within the military, but what they are after the military? So we have a transition assistance program, which has been there. And in a lot of ways, it was something that the military was doing as you're getting out. And we're going to take you through, here's your benefits, and do this and that. And we want to make it more than just checking the boxes. We want to make it a robust program that can actually help you transition into a productive lifestyle. When I came back from Iraq, so I served for a year in Iraq. I left my practice for 15 months. I was part of a large orthopedic group. And I got back and they said, well, you're a reservist. You don't have to go back to work for 90 days. And I said, well, first of all, it's my practice. And if I'm not there, there's no money coming in. So I said, but besides that, my adrenaline's been flowing, for a year, 24/7. I'm going next week. I'm going to start seeing patients again next week. And also, it's a little bit different for me. I was 47 when I came back. It's a little bit different than the young person who's making a transition and didn't have something established before. But I understood that feeling of wanting to be necessary still. And so the reintegration back into civilian life is an important thing that Congress should engage in, looking for meaningful employment or educational opportunities that are out there. And for far too long, the VA has been focused on so many other things that kind of gets overshadowed and kind of left up to the veteran as they're getting out. So a few weeks ago, I introduced bipartisan, what we call the Vet Op Act, and I did it in bipartisan fashion with Representative Takano, with Senator Rubio, and Senator Hassan. And it's a legislation that's going to prioritize veterans' employment and education programs at the VA. And so what I want to do is not put any new resources into it, but this would be a fourth administration within the VA using existing resources. And I think that that's important that we do it that way. I think far too often people think that people return from war and they're defeated and their skills are not applicable to anything in the civilian world, and really nothing could be further from the truth. And so I think it's important that we take a look at what does success look like in how we are managing the opportunities for veterans. And so just by giving them information and making sure they get all their benefits, that is one thing. But at the same time, how do we parlay that you have a good civilian life afterwards? Because truthfully, what I see and what I know is veterans and those that serve, they're strong people and they're dependable leaders. And they know how to show up on time. I was at an event one time with George Bush. He popped into town, and I was with the baseball owners, and I was with the owner of the Reds, and George just showed up, right? And they're like, well, what are you doing here? And he says, well, I'm working with veterans. I'm working with veterans. I'm teaching them a little bit of how to fill out a resume and do that type of stuff. Like when it says, you know, skills, you don't just put sniper. You know, there's not many job opportunities for that. But you say what your skills are, which is, I can do the job. So what we're trying to do is be consistent with our effort and make it separate. So the current VA has the Veterans Health Administration, Veterans Benefit Administration, and then the National Cemetery Administration. And the VBA is responsible for benefits, disability compensation, pensions, and economic opportunity, but often that economic opportunity gets put aside. So this would create a undersecretary, again, using existing resources, existing personnel, not adding to the number of employees, but they would deal specifically with these issues of education and employment. And I think about when you graduate from college, and that season is upon us. It's a whole lot better day when you get that diploma and you know where you're going to be in another week or two, that you have a job lined up and you're set and ready to go. But when you get that diploma and there's nothing there, it's a whole different scenario and a whole lot tougher. So think about that. You're transitioning from an environment where there's a brotherhood and a sisterhood and a team, and you're really essential. And I keep using that word, as essential, because a lot of times I think, we hear about PTSD, and I think for a lot of people what they really have is post-essential stress, because they've gone from one environment to another environment that's completely different. So I think that we want to proceed with this. Hopefully we can get this going and get it on the books and create something that's going to be of benefit to our veterans and transform things. The VA is a program that obviously was extremely well intended and still is, but has gotten very large and somewhat difficult. And on a different topic, if you will, if you look at healthcare, it's a different system, because in a private practice, you need to have quality and efficiency to keep your doors open. And so when patients come into you, that means you profit. That keeps you in the black. But in the VA, it's different, because when you're seeing patients, that's money going out the door. And so you have to change the attitude of what success looks like, where success is, are we seeing those that are eligible to be seen in a timely fashion with great access to care? That's what success needs to look like, and you have to change the motivation. We all know about the hidden wait list that occurred out in Phoenix and problems like that, because the motivation was, get patients in. And when I first got here, I remember sitting in front of the administrators for the VA, and they were all doctors, and I said, have any of you ever been in private practice where you had to be in the black to keep your doors open? And they all looked at each other, 5 of them, and none of them had. So what I'm excited about is that we have doctors in Congress, and we have veterans in Congress, and we have people that bring fresh ideas to try and make things better. And that's what you all do at AEI, and we appreciate that. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Let me build off of a couple of things you said there. You mentioned the VA Mission Act, this big omnibus bill that's going to be up this week. Obviously, that's been a lot of work. There's been a lot of focus. There's caregivers in there. There's an asset review. It's a lot of attention on VA and a lot of attention on these other issues, these health issues and everything. How do you, and you said hopefully it passes. From what I've heard, it should pass fairly easily. But how do you shift the conversation after this to the economic opportunity stuff? How do you, I mean, we've got a tight legislative schedule. This is really a very different way of thinking about what VA's responsibilities are. So with your legislation, how do you go back to your colleagues off the Veterans Affairs Committee and explain to them, look, the next step is not fixing hospitals, repairing houses. It's the next step is looking at this other issue that we've sort of ignored.
Well, I think it's like anything else. It's messaging. And if you look at this bill in particular, we're not adding new employees. And so we're just changing the direction for some people to be focusing more on this. I think people are getting a good understanding of this. There's no doubt about it that the suicides amongst veterans and the PTSD amongst veterans is very well known and very much a concern of everyone in Congress in a bipartisan fashion. So when you talk about this in terms of this as an opportunity to change that dynamic, a lot of people have the impression that people are depressed or suicidal because they served. And that's not necessarily the case. There may be things associated with service that may have led to that, but this is where I keep going back to, let's really look, let's go to the root causes. Let's take a real healthcare approach to this. Why does this happen? Especially when you look and you see that people didn't necessarily have these conditions while they were in uniform, why they were surrounded by their brothers and sisters, why they were doing essential missions every day, why they felt that they were key to the success of something, and that's what changes. Mm-hmm. And every story is different, so I don't mean to paint with a broad brush here. But I think that that's something that if you focus on that I think you'll greatly reduce some of the symptomatology that we see that develops later. And so it is a key issue to everybody, and it's been discussed for a long time. So it's not necessarily a new idea, but a new approach to the same idea.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is a topic that we've talked about, and many of the folks in this room have talked about for a while. As someone who has served and someone who's focused on these issues for quite some time, what's the frustration level that you still have to get back to that education point? That, hey, just because someone is not suicidal because they served, it's these issues of transition or these issues. What did you call it? Post-essential stress. Yeah.
I run it by a military psychiatrist just a few weeks ago, and he goes, "Let me chew on that." Yeah. And I said, which they like to do.
I won't start
right?
quoting it yet. But.
Yeah.
But what's the frustration level do you feel like you're making progress, not just with your colleagues, but with constituents, with the public, in understanding these issues?
I do, if you get the message out. And you really are changing some of the dynamic of the message that maybe you call it urban legend or this and that. And I mentioned earlier that, some people think that, oh, you joined the military and you're broken. No, you joined the military and you gain a lot of skills that you didn't have. I mean, most people, the majority will tell you that the military has served them very well. It's problems that they face afterwards, and that's where I'm talking about the VA having to be reactive. Let's be a little bit more proactive. The VSOs, the Veteran Service Organizations, they get this, right? Because they're in the same vein. So they do carry a large public message across all of their entities. And so that's helpful. And when you put something forward to the entire body, the House and the Senate, and you say, all the VSOs are for this, it has a little bit of an impact.
So you also brought up the fact that the number of employees is capped. This isn't adding any more bureaucracy, but we're in an administration right now that is not just looking not to add bureaucracy, but is looking to pull back on that. So I wonder what your response is to folks who are going to look at this and say, oh, another undersecretary, great, another level of bureaucracy. If we've already got this under VBA, why do we need to separate it out and treat it differently?
Because it is so key and it is being overlooked. And, we often I like to talk about dynamic scoring. What effect do you have over 20 years? So this may even be a situation, even if you were adding a few people, which we're not, but that's not the purpose. But even if you were, are you saving in the long run? Because if you are able to take a veteran and make them overall a more healthy individual because of their sense of purpose, because of an opportunity, then they're probably less reliant on the VA system for a lot of other things that you save. And, so I think the number within the United States of those that are eligible to use the VA is 36%. I just went to Puerto Rico. It's 72 there. 72% of veterans in Puerto Rico that are eligible for the VA use it. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but what I'm saying is if you have great other opportunities, I mean, a lot of veterans take the approach with health care. I have a job where I get health care, so I'm not going to use the VA because I want someone else to have that opportunity. And that's the attitude of a lot of veterans in that situation. I mean, other veterans say, I love the VA and that's where I always want to go regardless. That's fine, but I think you create a different dynamic. You create someone that probably will have fewer needs if they're in that track where they're going to school, know why they're going to school, what they're going to do at the end of the schooling. Are they getting training for a certificate for a job? Or are they just going directly into a job?
Let me ask you one more before we throw it to the audience for some questions here. How do you feel VA's doing emphasizing this side of things? Because you'll need VA buy-in to talk about these other programs and sort of shifting that idea. We have a VA right now that has, what's the polite way to put this, a leadership in flux.
Yes.
So how do you work with them in terms of emphasizing, hey, look, let's just not always talk about mental health. These are important issues, the health issues, the benefits issues, but why aren't we talking more about the economic opportunity side? Why aren't we talking about ways to lift up veterans?
Sure. Hopefully this will do that because it will give it greater emphasis within the VA. But I think that you will see more members of Congress talking about it. You'll see the VA committee talking about it more, and hopefully that will carry over. But you go around this country, we live in a country where we are the most giving country in the world, and people respect our military, and businesses respect our military. And so many businesses, I would say the majority of businesses today, have some kind of program where they're out to try and hire veterans. They have I look at Cintas in Cincinnati, they have a full-time staffer. That's their job, is to recruit veterans to come in. And so they can be part of that talk. They can be part of that process. And we have in Cincinnati Tri-State Veterans Center that is an entity that's developed, and it's nonprofit, and it's a place for veterans to go if they need help with getting their benefits, if they're looking for employment. And so we're tying local employers into this. So there's a lot of opportunity besides just here on the Hill for people to say, hey, we need this. You look around the country today, and there are a lot of people, as the economy's picking up, there are people looking for employees. And this is a great opportunity for our veterans and a great way for them to plug in. So I think that the conversation is beyond just Capitol Hill.
Okay. All right, great. Listen, I want to open it up. We do have a microphone floating around somewhere back here, so just raise your hand if you've got a question. We've only got a couple minutes left with the Congressman, but let's beat him up as best we can while he's in here.
Rough crowd.
Thank you very much. Leroy Costa with the Disabled American Veterans. Real quick, the Department of Labor's Veterans Education and Training operates the Transition Assistance Program in collaboration with the Veterans Benefits Administration. How would the Vet Op Act, how would that deal with this?
Well, it certainly would, in conjunction with Department of Labor and any other entity that is working towards getting our veterans into employment and education. Well, Department of Labor specifically into work opportunities. But you got to have that conduit, and sometimes that's tough. What I've run into a little bit is when you are the VA, you can't necessarily be steering someone towards a certain job or a certain school or something like that because you're showing some type of favoritism. And that's where we need some of the places like the Tri-State Veterans Center to be the conduit for that, for you to be a conduit for things like that, where you can bring employees in, where your VSO does that. So that's the type of thing that we'll be looking for. Any way we can refer someone on to an entity that can create opportunities and also have the veteran prepared to plug into that opportunity.
All right, great. Thank you.
morning, Congressman. I'm Bernie Edelman, Vietnam Veterans of America. VVA has for years been in favor of a fourth administration, exactly what you're talking about, because put the education, put training, put voc rehab, put veterans preference under one roof, basically. There's more. I understand the VA is not thrilled with that, but they're not thrilled with a lot of things, unfortunately. And this is something that should happen. Mm-hmm. We hope you'll send out a dear colleague letter, and your folks in the Senate would do the same thing to really get folks behind this. Comment on your post-essential stress. That may be part of it, but there are post-traumatic stress. There are too many guys who get out from my war, from the current wars, who it's not a case of not knowing what they're going to be doing. It's a case of they've come out of something that has been emotionally traumatic, and they have to be able to deal with it. The VA, in that respect, they don't have enough mental health clinicians, but they're very good at that. And this is something that we think is very necessary. VA is putting that under the rubric of the primary care. And there will be a lot of changes. And hopefully the president will come up with somebody who's good. The question I have for you, do you have anyone you might recommend?
I'll leave that up to the president and their administration. And I wasn't trying to diminish the reality of post-traumatic stress. Don't get me wrong. I just think that there's a component of that to it as well, as maybe a subset of that, if you will. And for some, that may be the level that it reaches, that they're not essential anymore. For others, it's the full-blown. I mean, you know, I saw the worst things I've ever seen. You don't see trauma like I saw in a civilian side very often, and not in those numbers. And it's pretty tough. I always talk about my deployment as the worst thing that I ever had to do, but the best thing I ever got to do because of the people I was with, right? And it was a pretty tough job, because part of my job was to tell soldiers and Marines when their buddy didn't make it. It was much better when I could tell them we pulled them through. But that's very challenging. I do think for me, as a doctor that had been practicing for years, trained in a city like Chicago, and 7 years old, because I did have a birthday while I was gone, it's a little bit different than the 18, 19-year-old. And I get that. So all those components come into play, and you're right about it's a shortage of mental health providers, it's a shortage of providers, period, and it's not just in the VA, it's across the country. So that's another issue we got to deal with, and residency training, et cetera.
Just real quick with that, though, and before your staff grabs me and throttles me for keeping you too long, but do you see anything with this legislation as taking away from those other issues? I mean, this is supposed.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I see it as an adjunct to those other issues, another form of treatment, if you will. I really do. I mean, it's people feel whole when they are part of something and contributing to something. And I contend that any job you have it because you're doing something that someone wants or someone needs. And that's a good feeling. And it all depends on how you look at everything. There's a story, someone says you go up to the lowest ranking sailor on the carrier who's swabbing the deck. And he goes, so what's your job? He says, I make sure planes land safely. You know, I talk about, as a surgeon, there's a lot I can do in the operating room, but I can't build that operating room. And I can't make the equipment I use, and I can't fix the equipment I use. Okay, so there's value to this that I think uplifts people in many ways, that can be an additional treatment, if you will, for those in need of other treatments.
All right, great. Listen, thank you so much for this. I'm going to ask everyone to stay in their seats while we reset for the next panel. But before that, let's give the Congressman a round of applause.
Thank
you so much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Are we all set? Good. Well, welcome. Thank you all for sticking around and for the patience there. We have a spectacular panel. I'm not going to read everybody's bio. We've got that online, but I would encourage you to go look up because we really have a lot of expertise up here. You all heard the Congressman's remarks here, and I know all of you have been familiar with this legislation, this idea for a while. Rebecca, I want to start with you because you wrote a pretty extensive paper on this idea and the issue of how we're viewing veterans when we put too much emphasis on just the mental health, broken veteran sort of idea. So I'm wondering if you can just start us off by talking about that and thoughts about how that works into this idea of promoting economic opportunity within VA.
Sure. So I'm actually going to start way back in 1946, 1947. So that year, Frank Capra and Jimmy Stewart lost out on a whole host of Academy Awards to this movie about three servicemen who were transitioning back into, actually, Cincinnati, congressman. And they were having a very tough time with it. And this movie is called The Best Years of Our Lives. It's not ironic. And it's about how three men who are thrown together into a cab on their way home navigate what it means to go from war to work. And one thing about this film is that this shows us how old this issue is. So 16 million men after the end of World War II, but that was also not something new to them after World War I, after the Civil War. This issue has been around in the US and other countries for a very long time. What does it mean to take men from war to work? And in the movie, there is an Air Force captain, there is a Navy sailor, and there is an Army captain. And Fred Derry, who is the Air Force captain, has probably the hardest time of all. He goes from the wonderful uniform, the heroics of being a captain in a B-17, to being a soda jerk, which is not a very glorious job. His wife cheats on him. You see him stumble across the stage at one point, going to the boneyard where all of the B-17s are left to the side. And he gets into one, and you think, oh my goodness, I didn't know that World War II movies were this dark. Is this the Vietnam War? This is going really bad. The music swells, and he closes his eyes, and you close your eyes, and then you hear this voice cut across, and it says, hey, what are you doing? Get out. What? And the foreman is there, and he says, we are converting these into prefabricated houses. And Fred Derry just kind of snaps out of it, and he says, wait, oh, you're the junk man. Everything ends up as junk. And the foreman returns, and he says, no, we're making the houses. Do you know how to do anything? He says, no, but I learned how to do something same up there as I can do down here. And so the movie ends, and you think, oh, what a nice cliche. It ends well. He learns how to do this thing. But really, it shows us four different things. One is, what was the thing that was needed? He needed some sense of identity that was meaningful to him. He needed that idea of building off of what he had learned from before. He needed some type of a community into which he could reintegrate, building a new community out of that old one. And that's exactly what all of the data recently shows us, is that veterans, as they are transitioning from their war to their work, need a sense of identity. They need community. And how they get those is through employment, and they get that employment through access through education. And so those elements are elements that have always been around. It won't take rocket science to figure out how to put those in order. And that's an immensely important thing that we need. It's like the seaway, the St. Lawrence Seaway, if you will. Get those boats in there, you close the gates, fill it up with water so they can go on their way. If you don't have those elements, what you're essentially doing is you're draining all the water and you're leaving them there trapped. So economic opportunity for veterans is the key, and or the doorway, if you will, to moving on towards successful reintegration into society, which both society and veterans need. And then education is the especially important 21st century component to that. We have an information society now, which means that different ways that veterans can transition back into society are open that were not available in a purely industrial-based model, which is what the Veterans Benefit Administration originally originated in, which was the presumption that veterans who had any type of disability or any perverse effects from their service would never enter employment again. And so there was that sense that you need to give them help along the way, but it would be for forever. They would never transition back into full employment. Whereas we have a very different model now. We have all these different ways where veterans can come back into the community. And what my paper and what the congressman was talking about was identifying those and then really maximizing them in a 21st century space so that we are actually showing veterans that that moment of transition, which is so vital and important, is not the end, it is the way. And that there are all of the different elements, all of the different tools that can be used that are there, and that we are willing to help, that there are employers who are willing to help, and that it is absolutely possible.
So Heather and Lauren, where are we on that now? I mean, are we even having those conversations, or are we too focused on the sort of the disability side? I mean, obviously with student veterans, you guys are focused on education, the next step and everything, but are we, when I say we, is the public still too focused on the broken veteran with disability? You know, this is VA is there as the ultimate safety net and not a building block sort of agency?
Sure. I think that it's sort of a two-part answer there. One, I think that Washington has historically, at least in the last 10 years, been very focused on health care and benefits. And that's justifiably so. If you look at the budgets of the VA, that's where the majority of the money is going to. So that's reasonable for Washington to associate the VA with sort of those legacy systems of healthcare and benefits. But I think if you expand that conversation to America, I think that America associates the VA with things that the greatest generation is most known for. That is the GI Bill, that is the home loan program. And so I think that the Vet Op Act that the congressman was talking about really doubles down on what the VA is well known for outside of the halls of Washington. And I think it's a solid investment in America based on what they're seeing as success in veterans and in the VA.
Yeah, no, Heather, I mean, you're working for PVA
Right.
with a population that has serious health issues and those challenges.
That's correct.
How does that work with when we're talking about the next step? I mean, we seem to put everyone in the category of can't work or can work and nothing in between.
There's a lot of in between. And as an organization, that in the name, all of our members have spinal cord injuries or diseases. Mm-hmm. So they are going to be people living with disabilities. That's how you become a member. But one of the things I really appreciate about our organization, our mission is, number 4 is to promote the civil rights and opportunities of our members so that they can achieve independence. And that really came from a society, 1946, when we were founded, that was very inaccessible to people who used wheelchairs. Employment, the built environment, a lot of difficulties there. So we see it's the same for a person who's acquired a significant disability, the opportunity to have that identity as being a part of your community, whether it's having your own business, working for somebody else, and whatever that looks like for you. It may not look like full-time employment. It may look different, but it doesn't mean that you need to forget that identity that you have with whatever your next step is.
Okay. Phil, you've done a lot of research on military personnel and on veterans. Talk to me about this idea. How do we shift, as I said to the congressman, how do we shift the narrative in terms of thinking about veterans in that different way? Or are we just always going to be thinking of Phoenix? Are we always going to be thinking of the most extreme scandals and disasters rather than what VA can do to promote veterans?
So I think what's helpful is to think of the broader context, and Rebecca's writing has been terrific for this. The VA has evolved over let's say the last 80 years or so, to really focus on compensating veterans for loss, whether it's for their injuries or illnesses or for lost time in the workforce, or for bringing them up to parity with non-veterans. What we're now talking about and have been talking about for the last 4 decades or so is a different vision of what we want to do for veterans, where the normative goal is not just to bring them up to parity, but really to help them thrive above and beyond what we see among non-veterans. We see this as important for the all-volunteer force, that we want to develop something of a cyclic cycle of service that is enriching and makes these veterans out to be an example, that you will be better off after you serve than beforehand. And that's a fundamentally different approach to service and to helping veterans than has existed for most of the VA's life. If we're going to do that, and that's our normative choice, then we probably need a new arrangement for the VA, a new set of programs, and new primacy for an undersecretary that is focused on something different than the undersecretary for health and the one for benefits, and certainly the one for cemeteries. And so I think that's the idea at the heart of this. I I think there are some hard questions to ask about it. Will this work? What goals ought we pursue? Beneath that, how do we measure success? But I think it's a sharp break from the history of the VA, and very consistent with what we see, particularly from the Defense Department, about the need to incentivize service, and from others out there.
And this is for any of you, but do you feel that we can even have that conversation? I didn't want to be excessively pessimistic with the congressman when he was up here, but we're going to have this major omnibus bill come up with VA this week. We've got a really short schedule. We've got a lot of stuff before midterms. And frankly, we've got a Congress that seems to be lurching from disaster to disaster rather than looking at these sort of proactive things. So this is a really interesting conversation, but it's the kind of conversation that Congress often can't engage in. Somebody bring this up, so I'm not horribly pessimistic. How do you shift this to a talking about thinking of VA in a different way and starting to shift that? Can you get lawmakers on that page?
I think you certainly can. Legislation, as we all know, takes time to, you mentioned some of the pieces that are pending this week, have been things that I know PVA has been working on for 8 years to expand benefits to caregivers. Right. It doesn't start, today and then I'm going to have a bill by the end of the month. Certainly the idea of having a fourth administration focused on transition and the programs that are really important to people who are transitioning, including those with disabilities or those who acquire disabilities later through illness, such as MS or ALS, that you have the ability to build on that. So I think we have a good opportunity now. We have good bipartisan champions that are wanting to make this a priority and to look at how we can transition into a different piece of VA, like what Phil was saying, a new focus on how do we move forward. I always say the building blocks of a person who acquires a catastrophic disability, the benefits in healthcare are key, but they are the building blocks that then help you to the next phase of your life, whatever that looks like for you, in employment, in education, accessible housing, things that would all be included in a new transition fourth administration are really key to that.
And I'll add, I think, the bill introduction on both sides of Congress showed that this has a lot of support from all aisles. When you look at the arguments that can be made around it, bringing greater accountability, changing the narrative, providing a direct counterpart across government for these types of programs, and then also the national security component of it, supporting the all-volunteer force, allowing DoD to more focus on readiness when you take transition into the hands of the VA. I think there's a lot of good things that can be said and can grab the attention of Congress. I would also say that VSOs in the veteran community have a really unique ability to bring attention to and champion things even in the darkest of times. A great example, this time last year, if you had seen the Forever GI Bill, it was all but considered dead.
I believe I wrote that it was dead.
Right? You might have once or twice. And then by August, the largest expansion of the post-9/11 GI Bill had been passed unanimously in both chambers. So I think we can do phenomenal things when we all band together around good policy, and I see this as another opportunity to do that same thing.
I was going to mention the Forever GI Bill and how that is an optimistic point, and then so there's kind of two. There's that. There's the idea that Congress is so underperforming, let's say, that a win of this type is a very good thing. And then second, a little bit more to the pessimism, is that if you look at the history of the VA, it has been a history of scandal that has not needed to have been a history of scandal. And part of that is just because it has morphed and grown kind of helter-skelter here, there, as it has responded to different historical moments. And as opposed to being able to step back and look and say, we're 2018 now, it's almost 80, 100 years later, maybe we as Congress should think, what do we want VA to do as a whole? And what do each of these administrations want to do? What can they do? What are good things either to farm out or not farm out? I know that's a very delicate conversation, but just looking at all of the employment sector and education sector now, all of the different things that can happen that we have the ability to do, what makes most sense for VA as the organization? And then part of that is, in looking through, I've been spending the past few months looking at all the scandals from all the years, but the counter to that is that you see how legislation in and of itself creates an immensely powerful narrative. And so back to your point about kind of the broken veteran narrative, part of that has come about as a byproduct of legislation that has been emphasizing helping veterans who are adversely affected by their service. And so the narrative that has grown up is that you serve, you are affected by service in these negative ways.
So even just having the legislative debate then shifts the focus and shifts some of that.
Right. And so if you say, well, what about helping veterans? What about all of these opportunities? What about these positive outcomes? Look how veterans, once they have participate in these programs, look how much, how their incomes are better than their civilian counterparts. They have higher levels of education. Their health is excellent, or grows over time, because employment, of course, is this baseline that positively affects each one of those outcomes. And various different organizations have done those studies, so it's not just me saying that or interested people. So that means that if you shift that narrative, of course, by creating a fourth administration, then you are powerfully showing that there is this positive thing. You can shift that narrative. And I think that in and of itself is an immensely powerful and positive thing that Congress can do, and that it should recognize it has that power to do.
So, Phil, you mentioned that if we do create this fourth administration, there's a lot of details to be worked out. I wonder what do you all think that this looks like? I mean, is this as simple as just, great, we've got another undersecretary and we just shift things over? Or, I mean, what are the uncomfortable conversations about? We had mention of Department of Labor and their vets issues and the conflict between that and VA.
So there are probably 3 levels of questions we need to ask. The first is, what changes within VA? So do we pull in home loans, GI Bill, vocational rehab? What are the programs within the agency that get realigned under a new undersecretariat? The second is, what gets moved around within the interagency, where we have the Labor Department. The Defense Department has a massive amount of effort that it puts into transition, as it probably rightly should, given that it owns those folks until the day of their discharge. It does a lot for the reserve components as well. It does some support for families. What of that moves over, or what dotted line relationships do you create? Who owns the new contracts that come about? And the third would be partnerships with the private sector and the nonprofit sector. Do we endow this new undersecretariat with new legal authorities with which to contract, with which to enter into partnerships? How do they relate to academia? Those are a lot of questions that are not yet answered in Congressman Wenstrup's legislation. They probably will be fleshed out over a period of months or years as it's studied and there's testimony and there's more thought given to it. But creating government is hard. It's not something that is done easily or quickly, and I think just starting the conversation will hopefully catalyze these questions being asked.
Is it something that you think can be done without creating more bureaucracy? I mean, there's a cap on, there's a cap within this legislation that says we won't add more folks. We obviously, as I said before, have an administration that's not interested in expanding bureaucracy, at least from their rhetoric. So when you're talking about those complexities, when you're talking about new contracting authorities, you're usually talking about more people.
Yes, but there may have to be something of a salsa dance here, where you go 3 steps forward and 3 steps back.
Yeah.
You can imagine a world where you also pursue some delayering initiatives within the VA, or you use contracting to temporarily acquire capacity and then shed it. Those are going to be the kinds of steps necessary to create a new organization, but at the same time examine the efficiencies of existing organizations, particularly as they shed some of their functional responsibility.
Rebecca, do you see any, when you're looking at this, I mean, what's your vision of how it gets pulled together?
Well, I'll answer the challenge first, which is who will lead it. I think that's the most glaring question that there is, and obviously that's a very difficult question. But I do think that by taking programs of the GI Bill, the education, the vocational rehabilitation out from under the VBA, will give both the Undersecretary of VBA and the proposed fourth administration secretary more of a tangible field to work with. So you might get someone who actually has experience in the education field, or even that technology information sector, which is one of the big problems right now. I think you might have someone who would be interested in tackling that and seeing the great opportunity that there is there. In terms of moving things over, well, all of bureaucracy is a little sclerotic, right? And the VA is sclerotic. But wouldn't this be a good impulse, something that a good impulse could actually move forward? Most of the office already exists under the VBA, so it's a matter of just kind of giving it that new line of authority, pushing it up from underneath it and saying, now go, do great things.
I'll only add that we've sort of framed this and thought of this not necessarily as a growing of government, but a retrofit to adequately give the economic opportunity programs that are doing well, that are seeing success, and are supporting this whole health model of care that the veteran community has sort of championed in the last few years. A true champion at VA, somebody that has a lot more authority to make sure that those programs continue to run well and identify any sort of areas where we can improve or change those programs to meet the need even better. So.
Let me ask you and Heather, since you're engaged with VA and talking to folks, is there anyone right now who can even talk about this? I mean, this is not, for the last year since the start of the Trump administration, I shouldn't say all the focus, but the majority of the focus has been on health issues, been on community care, been on accountability, the choice program. Frankly, passing the Forever GI Bill was such a surprise to me because there just wasn't conversation among the higher ups with this. So we're now in a situation where we don't have a secretary, and we may not have one for a while longer. There's a handful of other key leadership positions out, but I don't know who's even talking about economic opportunity within VA at higher levels to sort of plot out these kind of larger, thematic shifts.
Go ahead.
I'm not sure that we have that crystal ball at this time. But I think one of the role of the veteran service organizations is to assist VA in having those conversations. We work closely with implementation of plans that come from Congress, and would do so with this. I think there are a lot of good people who are at the VA today, who are running the Voc Rehab program and home loan and the various programs that would be part of this. And this would be a catalyst to begin to have those conversations and figure out how can we reorient to better serve veterans that are transitioning not only from service but maybe even transitioning from disability into the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and I said this earlier, but this isn't any sort of attack on anybody at VA. The programs are run well. They've got great people behind them. What this is doing is truly giving them somebody in charge of the ship to really champion their issues and right size sort of the attention that's given to these issues. And so I'll just add that to what Heather was saying. And then the other thing on sort of this leadership influx situation that we find ourselves in with VA, I think that's even more reason to have this conversation because we would no longer be dependent on a personality that would care about these issues. If you have an undersecretary of benefits that may care about these, if they're there for a year or two, then they're gone. Who knows how long they're there. And then we're sort of back at square one of somebody wanting to champion these issues within VBA. So elevating this into its own fourth administration will solidify that there will be somebody at some point who's a true champion for these programs.
One of the things I found interesting with what the congressman said was this idea of, and I think Phil, you brought this up too, the idea of partnerships and how does that work, and what relationship can they have. We saw that with the homeless programs in recent years, sort of this renewed the HUD vouchers going out, and how do we engage with community organizers who might have a better handle on this. What's the barrier going to be for doing that with economic opportunity when you're talking about things like, how do we partner with people to promote job hiring programs or job training programs? How does that even work? How do we get to that point?
I don't know if I can answer how we get to that point, but I will say an opportunity in this fourth administration is for the VA to expand its knowledge and partnership with universities and colleges across the country. Student veterans are succeeding at amazing rates with higher GPAs, higher success rates. Business, STEM, and health-related fields are the three top majors student veterans are pursuing. And so they're true successes on campus, and there's a really unique opportunity to harness the power of higher education to further empower veterans that I think the VA hasn't quite capitalized on yet, and this role could certainly take that on as a charge.
You might think about this as a whiteboarding exercise, and what is the agency that does help veterans thrive in the economy is an open question. Right now, we have a portfolio of programs that's largely a safety net. They help veterans in need. They help veterans when they reach periods of unemployment. There are some programs, particularly those run by the Small Business Administration, that are more focused on opportunity, that have a different modality to them. But it is an open question how government helps people thrive. Often we think that the way government helps people thrive is to step out of their way and to relieve them of tax burdens or to relieve them of regulatory burdens. In this case, we're looking to do something more catalytic, and so maybe they act through universities, maybe they act through seed grants, maybe they act through other things, community investment corporations and so forth. That's actually a really interesting question that we ought to study, and we ought to inform ourselves with a lot of data here too. One thing you might think about embedding in this statute are new authorities for this agency to pull in IRS data or to pull in data from other agencies and know in real time the actual economic trajectory of the veterans they're trying to help. Because too often we're reliant on data that's a year or two old or aggregated or very volatile like the employment numbers. And if we're going to help veterans thrive, we ought to know more about them in order to do so.
I was going to say there's also the element of education of employers. So, there's two sides to that employment education. One is the veterans involved, and the other are the employers. So there's been a few studies that are very concerning that have come out lately. One by Edelman Insights, which is just in the forefront of my mind, which is that employers overwhelmingly, it's something like 70 to 80%, do not think veterans will be successful in a career. Where did they get that from? Once again, I think that goes back to the prevalent, whatever that word is, of the broken veteran narrative, and just kind of this cultural idea that has come about that veterans are broken by their service and that they can't function successfully in society. But it turns out that veterans actually have great careers, and they are, once again, more successful than their civilian peers. But employers need some help, if you will, in understanding what are the skill sets that veterans bring to the table, what are some of the challenges that they face just in soft communication skills, in identifying how to translate those skills across the board. And I think that could be something that, once again, a fourth administration within the VA can help do.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm looking at a pretty veteran-friendly crowd in here, and we sort of know this, but I did want to jump back on what do we know at this point about veteran success when it comes to education, when it comes to employment? I know you've all worked on this and done some research, so could we just do like a quick recap of, do veterans succeed in school? Do veterans what do we know about veterans' employment afterwards and the kind of salaries they make?
Sure. So SVA last year produced the National Veteran Education Success Tracker, INVEST for short. And in it, I sort of already spoke to some of the data points in it, but veterans are succeeding at about a 72% rate in terms of graduation from institutes of higher education. They have 3.34 GPA versus the national average of 2.94, so that's pretty impressive in its own right. Again, the three top majors are business, STEM, and healthcare-related fields, so high-demand fields that have great probability for employment down the road. And as Rebecca has said, they do have higher earnings in comparison to their non-veteran peers. So by and large, veterans are incredibly successful in higher education, and I encourage you to read the INVEST report in its entirety to really see a lot of the other great data points that have been pulled. And that was using some pretty great data in conjunction with the VA. So it's an example of how we can leverage all these different data points to show why we need to invest more in the economic opportunity of veterans.
Paralyzed Veterans created a program back in 2007 that's our own vocational rehabilitation program. It serves a broader population than that would be eligible for VR&E at VA. And our counselors, even though they're serving some of the most difficult to place, you're talking about a lot of additional issues happening. When our members come in, it's pretty clear that they have a disability most of the times. They're using a wheelchair, so you have to deal with some additional issues. But even with that, our counselors have a very good placement rate and retention rate, which is something that's really important. Is not just getting into the workforce, but then remaining in the workforce and continuing to escalate in your career path. For some people, they encounter problems once they get into the workforce, balancing, a disability they do have, medical appointments, things like that, and having the long-term assistance that they can get from counselors that help keep them in the workplace is really key to that continuing identity.
Is that, I don't know if you have a sense, is that getting any easier as we get further along here? I mean, this generation of veterans has been around for a while now. I mean, we've been dealing with these kind of conversations, these issues for more than a decade. Is it, when you're talking about disabled veterans, especially this generation of disabled veterans, which has a different set of advantages medically than some of the older ones, is it any easier to get them a job? Is it still thinking of the World War II veteran who's wheelchair bound and shell shocked and is never going to be able to work, even when you see in front of you this is a different person?
We are seeing in general the employment of people with disabilities is increasing. It's an area overall for people with disabilities that is still not where it needs to be. We are, for people who have obvious disabilities, so the person who uses a wheelchair, we're starting to see that people are understanding, you can accommodate it, this person can work, they can do what they need to do. So we are starting to see some attitudinal shifts, but we're not fully where we need to be. That is still a barrier for employers understanding that most accommodations, if any, that an employee needs are under $500. The vast majority are free. And so making sure that we're helping employers see that for those transitioning service members who do have a disability, that doesn't preclude work or the ease of work. We just have to maybe think outside the box.
So we're at, I think that the numbers last month for veterans unemployment nationwide were again below the national average and have been very good. So, if I wanted to be horribly cynical about this, I would say, why, if we're doing okay there, I'm always horribly cynical. That's different. But if we've got that number, like, why do we need to worry about this that much? Okay, fine. Like, yeah, it'd be nicer if we sort of change the vision, but things seem like they're going okay. So why stress about it?
I'll say two things really quickly. One, I said this earlier, but you should always double down on what you're good at. And so if this is working well, if education and employment and home loans are working well for veterans, let's double down on that because that's a smart investment. The second thing is that the VA historically has served as almost a proving ground for things from healthcare to benefits, education. The GI Bill democratized higher education. And so this is an opportunity to, again, double down on that investment and that progress to see how we can sort of capitalize on some of the gains we've seen with disabled veterans to help better employ all disabled Americans or help non-traditional students across the board in higher education succeed at higher rates. So I think it's an opportunity to just continue the historical legacy of the VA being the driver of change in America.
And I think that's a really key point, Lauren, is the focus that veterans have really paved the way, and disabled veterans have paved the way a lot of times for the advances in the broader community for the nearly 60 million Americans who have disabilities. So I think there really are some key points that we want VA to continue to be the leader in those efforts because of the societal change that can actually create.
All right, great. Listen, I want to open it up. I've thrown a lot of different topics at you, so I want to open it up to the room for questions here. Raise your hand if you've got one. There's a mic floating around somewhere, I believe. Got a couple over here.
Derek Fernbarger with the Winter Water Project. I had a few questions, but I think one of the areas that I think Winter Water is most concerned about with the fourth administration is resources. So the legislation right now only adds one additional person for the new administration. But right now, that administration, the Undersecretary for Economic Opportunity, shares a lot of resources with VBA. So if you pull them out and you only add one person, do you see that you could potentially harm the programs that they actually perform by not adding any resources?
I don't, because maybe I'm being a little bit too naive here, but I would move the appropriation lines over with them. So I don't think that you're taking anything away. You're just moving the money over to follow them.
Go ahead, Phil.
An undersecretariat is not just one person. It would have, a principal deputy and a support staff and a number of other capabilities built up around it over time. It's all in the implementation. The agency chief of staff would typically get a legislative mandate like this and develop a plan where they would build those over time. And ideally, they would look for efficiencies, as they say, pulling them over from VBA or the other parts of the VA. The idea that you would do this with net zero gain in personnel is probably unrealistic, but over 2 to 3 years, you might see it come closer to that.
But this goes back to what I asked the congressman about. Does this very easily become portrayed as pitting one set of priorities against another? And if you are pulling anything from VBA, is it whether or not it's a reality? Does it just become a concern that you're attacking benefits in some way, or even the larger issue of, look, if you're trying to get me to work, if you're trying to help me to work and everything, are you going to start taking away my benefits? We've all heard plenty of stories of veterans who are unhappy with their benefits rating or feel like VA is just trying to nickel and dime them. So I guess how do you work the public message here so that it's not seen as, we're gonna take away parts of VBA in order to stand up this other administration?
I mean, I think it goes back to the idea that elevating these programs is actually a positive message to veterans, that we care so much about empowering you and providing economic opportunity programs that it warrants its own undersecretary to make sure that there's a true champion for these issues. And going back to the question of, does this potentially harm existing programs? I think the opposite, because now you've got somebody with undersecretary authority who's a champion for things like IT funds, and it's not pitting one against the other. They're entirely complementary. But now we're just sort of leveling the playing field for those programs. And instead of they actually are pitted right now, right? They're all under one silo, and so they are being pitted for those same IT resources, the same attention from leadership. Pulling that out just provides greater opportunity for collaboration, greater opportunity for complementary services, and greater opportunities to see all sorts of IT systems improved across the board, not one over the other.
The $64 billion question is whether there are long-term cost savings in this, whether the VA will spend less and society will gain by investing in veterans in this way. And if that's true over 5 years or 50 years, and this is a long-term home run, and there's the cost argument right there. We don't know that yet. We think it's true. We think that when we spend money on the GI Bill, we get it back many times over. That was certainly the experience of the World War II generation. We still probably need to know a little bit more about how these investments play out and whether there's that sort of long-term arbitrage that we can play here.
Feel any better? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jason Peller with Heroes Linked. We're a program in the transition and career development space. To Mr. Shane's question at the end of the session, why focus on something that seems to be working well? In our world, it's the retention issue. While employment is low, we're seeing upwards of 65% of veterans leaving their first post-military job in under 2 years, cohort of up to 45% of them leaving in under a year. So I'm kind of curious why we're starting to have these upper-level, very DC conversations, which is what we do very well here. And I'm kind of curious what you think a big agency shift is really going to affect when rubber hits the road in places like Ohio, Virginia, where we're talking about real people in real jobs. I mean, I think Disabled Veterans America probably is acutely aware of retention issues. So I'm just kind of curious where you think, because it's not just getting hired. That's a process point. It's being employed and thriving after that hire point. And I'm curious how the VA is going to impact that. Thank you.
Well, I think it does go back to the employer question, which is that employers and the types of employment that veterans will want to do need to be better educated about the types of skills, the skill sets that veterans can bring to the table so that they are being hired in the types of jobs that they do want to have and not simply flipping burgers somewhere, though flipping burgers can be immensely purpose-filled. And so I think that that is one of the elements of it. I do think, however, you hit on something quite right, which is that ultimately there is an individual level question here. I don't think that that goes away. And so that reminds me and brings me back to the larger society question, which is, how are college students doing in their first few years after their college? I changed jobs several times. I'm sure everyone here has changed jobs several times. our whole society no longer enters one particular place of employment and stays there for 20 or 30 years in the way that maybe our parents or our grandparents did. So I think that the stats are somewhere around, you probably know this better, Lauren, somewhere around 6 or 5 or 6 different even career changes can be expected in our lifetime, which means that there is education at each moment of that and kind of growing with your own self about where you want to go with your employment. And that's an open question. It's not, I'm not sure that it is a mark of failure that people are changing jobs. And I think maybe we should think about that question.
But I guess this goes to Phil's point about what kind of research goes along with this and how it gets in. What do we know about job satisfaction and post-graduation satisfaction at this point? Is there any reliable data? I feel like I've written a couple of disparate studies here, but is there anything that you all know of that exists at this point that sort of gets to that issue of not just our veterans finding a job, but our veterans happy and succeeding?
So we did a couple of studies on this, and our findings were that veterans do have rates of retention that are comparable to other new populations in the workforce of employees, particularly new college graduates. They moved around a lot, and the sense was that fit was hard to determine while you're in the service, and that fit was a process, transition was a process, and it would take a year or 2 years in the workforce to identify your fit, to acquire soft skills, and to cycle through the opportunity until you found some actualization, and that was natural and healthy, and that there was going to be very little that could be done to correct that, although there could be some different approaches within TAP, like apprenticeship programs or more focused effort for people who might have greater fit problems. Also, transition through higher education seemed to be better because it gave people a much longer period with which to test their fit and also leverage the resources of a campus and its career services office and so forth.
Since we specifically did mention disabled veterans, I think having taking out the employment and transition programs from under the disability comp side will help to elevate that this is a continuing relationship. I think of a veteran I spoke with who had a disability, was having problems getting an accommodation with her employer, and told me, well, I guess I'm just going to have to leave work and apply for medical retirement. She was a young woman. And when I let her know that actually she could request telework as a reasonable accommodation, even though her agency didn't allow that, the disability laws do, it opened up a new view for her that she didn't even know existed because no one was talking to her about this. So I think that there are some underutilized things that are not focused on when we have, the education and the getting you a job. But there is that longer term piece that I think having a broader focus on transition and how for some people, particularly if you have a disability that is going to change probably throughout your life, you may need broader assistance. We hope that a fourth administration and focus on that could eventually lead to that.
Great. Question back, a couple questions over here too.
Hi. Ryan Richardson from Leidos. We talked a little bit about the IT part already and the added costs associated with setting up the fourth administration. Just to put it more into perspective, I think, we're going to talk about updating the new IT strategic plan, the long-term strategic plan for the administration. We're talking about a new capital investment plan, a whole litany of administrative changes throughout the organization, in addition to unclear contracting authority on the part of the fourth undersecretary. Is there not a little bit of risk in potentially moving forward with the VA Op Act and relying on a dysfunctional Congress, or whatever you call it, Rebecca, right, to pass the appropriate appropriations with the teeth to support the fourth administration? I'm just curious about how risk tolerant we are with a potential problem moving forward. I mean, obviously there will be some appropriations for a fourth administration should this bill pass, but if it's not enough, how do we assist in ensuring that the programs currently under VBA don't potentially suffer? Another resource question in the same vein of what the gentleman over there asked, but just understanding that larger picture, wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
I think that one of the benefits of having a fourth undersecretary will be accountability. It's very hard to have accountability with any of the programs within VA. Simply, they guard their information very closely. They also measure, or they seem to measure, as a lot of government does, outcomes versus outputs versus outcomes. So by actually having a fourth administration that is tangible, that you can see, that we can actually employ some measurability to, I think that would give us the information to see, is it risky, is not, are we losing money, or are we not? And then take those lessons learned and apply them across VA, which would be a huge benefit added.
And I would only add, and maybe I'm the eternal optimist to the pessimist, but I think over time we have seen that Congress has always risen to the challenge of providing for veterans in the VA where necessary and where applicable. We look at the Choice Program over the last 3 years, which time and time again was given the appropriations it needed, despite the challenges that we're facing it to get to that need. The VA was one of the few administrations that actually saw an increase in their budget because it is a priority for this administration to make sure that veterans are taken care of. And so maybe I'm optimistic to truly believe that with great advocacy and good policy and strong advocates on Capitol Hill that we have in the committees and their great staff, that we'll continue to see that go.
Well, I guess just to the point I think a couple of you raised earlier, I don't think anyone on this panel sees the Vet Op Act as the final product. It sounds like this is the opening salvo to start the conversation, have this, but a lot of those issues will have to be worked out as it goes along, and I can't imagine that there won't be somebody who brings up the appropriations issue and what this might add. So, got a question back over here.
My name is Hassan. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan and have invisible injuries, including TBI from high explosive blasts, and I'm not affiliated with any organization. I also have poor soft skills, or soft communication skills, so I apologize. But is there any plans in place to reach the veterans on the ground, the warfighters, that are not able to receive the programs that Congress is passed and funded by men and women like you all? I worked on Capitol Hill before I enlisted, and I was born and raised in Arlington, Virginia, and I have deep roots in the community. It's only been since we have started driving 580 miles from our location that we began to see progress and access to the programs that are passed by the legislators and funded, because there's just so many levels in between us. So I was just wondering if there's anything, if that was being addressed or.
VA has made an emphasis of outreach to veterans, but it seems like a lot of these issues, especially when you're talking about that career focus forward, are going to have to start with folks who are serving and folks who are warfighters now, folks who are in the middle of already in the ranks. So, do you see this role as one that can better coordinate with DoD and maybe fill in some of those gaps with the transition programs?
I absolutely do. I think that one of the greatest aspects of this conversation and this idea is that an undersecretary would provide a more direct counterpart to the DoD, to the Department of Labor, to people on the ground to be held accountable and to be a champion for these programs. I also think that there's a greater conversation that we can have about, are there some innovative ways that we can connect with veterans on the ground and warfighters, whether through greater access and coordination with community programs like libraries, or K-12 schools, where you're sending your kids. There's a lot of opportunity for growth in how we connect with people. And I think that going back to this idea of an undersecretary only provides a greater opportunity for that to happen and to potentially move forward is important to note.
There's an interesting question in this, which is who the VA exists to serve and what it will do to serve them. Historically, the VA has been an agency that's been reactive. It's required veterans to come to it for benefits, for health care, for cemeteries. And in doing so, it's kept its population a little bit low, such that only 20 or 30% utilize VA programs across the board on average. We're now talking about a vision of the VA where it will reach out to all veterans and serve all 21 million veterans, potentially their families too. It's a very expansive vision, and it's not clear the VA has the culture, the mindset, the resources, et cetera, to do it. It's also interesting to think about what might be the effects of that on healthcare and other benefits programs. If the VA all of a sudden begins to do outreach in this vein, does that drive up utilization in the other? I think it's a very complicated calculus and one that we ought to think about as we embark on this legislative journey.
You have a follow-up?
The reason 24 months ago I began participating in the VA was because they solicited me surfing where I was beginning to heal. I would have never interacted with the individuals that offered to do a interest inventory so that to know how to plan the schooling as I was recovering. But it was that they are very proactive in coming out and getting us into the system. But that's all.
It seemed like that vision, though, that conversation is dependent on having a strong leader, or at least a leader, to the agency. So I pose this to the congressman. I mean, if we're in a situation where there's a interim VA secretary right now, there's a deputy who's being stonewalled by the administration and will be fired at some point soon. There's not the head of a Veterans Health Administration right now. We just got the head of the Veterans Benefits Administration. Are we even at a point where we can start to have these conversations if there's no one within VA to have these higher level, philosophical debates?
Well,
I'm bringing the room down again.
I would say if you don't have the conversations now, when will you? And we would simply be perpetuating what has always plagued the VA, which is slap a Band-Aid on it when you don't have time and you're just trying to stop all the, I'm horribly mixing my metaphors right now, but when you're trying to stop all the leaks, as opposed to let's think very carefully about what it is that we want VA to do, what can it do, how do we go about crafting that and making that actually happen. And I don't think that it's going to happen in one fell swoop. I think maybe that is a dream, and because it doesn't happen, then we just abandon it. So why not go about it and think, okay, what is this need? What is this need? What is this need? What would a fourth administration do? What then would it free the others to do? How does that all together collectively go towards improving VA?
And I think, I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again, that sort of focusing on the current situation of the VA is personality-driven policy. We're hyper-focused on, well, today there's not somebody there, or today, literally today, we have a new Undersecretary for Benefits. That's a dangerous precedent to set, that we only focus on the moment in time and the people in charge at the time, and that's a dangerous idea that we legislate and create policy around personalities of the moment. And I think the role of advocates and the role of Congress is to try to sort of be above that and say, regardless of who's there, regardless of the leadership situation, this is what's best for veterans, and we're going to figure out how to make it work.
Great. I think we got time for one or two more quick questions. We got one over here.
Hi, I'm Jamie. So I just have a question based on the current House and Senate that we currently have and our administration. I understand that you guys are assessing the educational benefits for veterans and whatnot. Have you guys assessed any of the policies such as HB 620 when it was active, which basically they wanted to decrease the remedial measures for people who had complaints about their ADA rights being violated? So have you guys assessed any of those things in reference to education, in reference to this specific legislation that might be coming out? Because obviously, policy outside of this is always going to affect this policy. We also have an administration that refuses to do certain things when it comes to equal employment opportunities, et cetera, based on disability. And, we're talking about veterans here, and a lot of them do have disabilities. So I just wanted to know what you guys thought. Have you guys done those assessments? Will you be doing those assessments based on what our current Congress thinks, including the congressman that was here? He voted yay for the HB 620, which would have negatively impacted soldiers with disabilities.
So Paralyzed Veterans was a key organization in the fight against HR 620, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Education Reform Act, which would have made some changes to that law. Obviously, PVA is also on this stage as a supporter of the fourth administration. So what we see is that it is our responsibility as advocates to make sure that we hold accountable our leaders, for PVA's perspective, are the civil rights and opportunities. So we make sure we're gonna advocate for a strong Americans with Disabilities Act. That's what allows our members access to the built environment to be able to work. But we're also going to support and feel that there is a vital opportunity of support for a fourth administration that leads to transition. I think the issues aren't black and white, and the Americans with Disabilities Act had very broad bipartisan support when it was passed, and then later amended in 2008. And we saw that even again, that there was bipartisan opposition to H.R. 620. So I think that the way that we view this is that there is good policy out there. We have to figure out how to negotiate some of the different actors on both sides. We don't see those as mutually exclusive, and think that that this particular bill, the Vet Op bill, is something that would really help to promote the rights of people with disabilities to be able to get education, to be able to transition, because it's going to put a priority on those programs in the way that we don't necessarily see now.
All right, great. Listen, thank you all so much. I think we're going to leave it there. I'd encourage all of you to beat up our panelists afterwards and get extra questions from them, but I'd like to give them a round of applause. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.